Hi, and welcome to the 9th episode of our Needle Engine Devlog. This time I'm going to talk about the 4.6 release and the changes it brings. One big thing that we did in the 4.6 release is take a good look at our post-processing pipeline and improve it in a few crucial areas that lead to higher quality and better performance. In particular, we looked at the correct ordering of effects for efficient rendering and the best results for anti-aliasing of your scenes. We also improved the performance and the stability of post-processing and adjusted how custom effects can get put into the effects chain. So basically, you can imagine having a stack of post-processing effects in your scene, and now you have much more control over where in that stack custom effects apply to. And that's important if you're building fancy custom effects that change, for example, how occlusion or reflections work in the scene, because these should happen early in the post-processing stack. Or if you're modifying final colors for like color grading and so on, because that belongs late in the post-processing stack. We also found a case where multi-sampling in conjunction with post-processing was behaving not as good as it could be and had a negative impact on performance for some scenes. So we fixed that as well. And because this topic of anti-aliasing and post-processing is so important, you need it in almost every project, we decided to make a technical article about it that is posted on Needle Cloud. You can find it on the page there, in which we talk about the key concepts behind how anti-aliasing works, how post-processing and anti-aliasing work together, and how you can set up your scenes to get the highest possible quality out. The article has a number of nice pictures showing how those scenes look like without anti-aliasing, how do they look like when anti-aliasing is on, what happens when post-processing comes into play, and so on. And we're taking a good look here at a lot of technical details that are important if you want to get your renderings right. Needle Engine, of course, takes care of a lot of the details that matter there, like the order of effects, when to use multi-sampled anti-aliasing and when not, and so on. So you can concentrate on setting up effects in your scene and tuning them so that you get the results that you want. We also made an application in Needle that demonstrates a lot of the concepts that the article talks about. For example, how ambient occlusion affects how anti-aliasing works in a scene, how multi-sampling comes into play, and all the other things that the article talks about. And in this demo application, you have a lot of settings to adjust stuff. And in this application, you have a lot of control over how these different effects are applied and can look at how does my scene look with subpixel anti-aliasing applied, with or without post-processing, with or without tone mapping and ambient occlusion, or look at how ambient occlusion affects the perception of your scene, like how it looks. And there's also an example of a custom post-processing effect. We added a little magnifying lens that you can control, and that helps to look at pixels in detail to really see where do thin edges appear in particular combinations of settings, what is the correct setup for the type of content that you have, and so on. For example, here we can see that little white fringes appear around some parts of the geometry, and those are caused by multi-sampled anti-aliasing being applied to the scene, and then ambient occlusion coming along and darkening areas. And what happens is that screen space ambient occlusion relies on depth information in your scene, whereas the color information is now anti-aliased. And so in these areas here, the depth and the color don't quite align, and we get these fringes on geometry. And the solution is often to use what's called post-process anti-aliasing. In our case, SMAA, which is the abbreviation for subpixel morphological anti-aliasing. And it single-handedly removes those white fringes from your scene. Because when SMAA is on, we can turn off anti-aliasing on the base render target. This is going into a lot of technical and development detail that is explained quite well in the article. So if you want to know more about the details on how this works and why it works and how you should set up your scenes, I recommend taking a look at the article. If you just want to play with the code, you can do so as well. As usual, we're providing a StackBlitz page that uses Needle Engine, that leverages Needle Engine to render this scene and shows how to set up post-processing effects from code, how to create custom post-processing effects like the magnifier that we have in the demo, how to pass settings into custom effects. Like here we have a magnification ratio, we have a radius, we have a bend strength for this cool lens effect here. Ooh. And all of this can be found in the code here. There's a magnifier effect that extends from post-processing effect, which is our base class, exposes the number of settings that are also used in the UI here, and then demonstrates the actual shader code. Like, what do you have to write in terms of shader code to have a custom effect that integrates into the post-processing pipeline. And you can go in here and tweak stuff and change things and make it your own. In the 4.6 release, we also fixed a couple of other small things that depend on pixels being moved around in exactly the right way. For example, screenshots before didn't take custom device pixel ratios into account. Like, they always worked across devices. But when you were setting a lower device pixel ratio manually, like you maybe do on a Retina screen on a low power device, then screenshots were slightly off, and that is now also handled correctly. That's it for this week's update. I recommend checking out the anti-aliasing and post-processing article and maybe some of the other articles on Needle Cloud. They go pretty deep into some of these topics if you want to understand more about how post-processing works, how anti-aliasing works, and so on. So I recommend checking that out. For those of you who are making trade show exhibits, museum apps, and other things that need to run completely offline, we made a change that allows it to embed external resources into your app so they don't need to be downloaded at runtime from an external server. For this, we made a new Wheat plugin that you can enable in your Needle project. It's called Make Files Local, and that's exactly what it does. Currently, it supports downloading fonts from Google Fonts, including their CSS files, and HDRI textures and similar from Polyhaven. So with this enabled, what happens is that at build time, we're basically downloading these resources as they are at the time you're making a build, and then they're embedded with your application so that they're not coming from an external server. We also made a small change to how audio sources preload their content. In effect, this means that when someone, for example, clicks a button to play a sound, the sound will already be there to play and not download in that moment, making things more snappy and feel faster. Unfortunately, we had to mark our deploy to glitch component as deprecated because Glitch has stopped offering their services. Fortunately, by now we have Needle Cloud as an alternative that allows you to upload your apps seamlessly to the web and even keep multiple versions of them around. So for those of you who have still relied on Glitch for hosting their apps, we recommend checking out Needle Cloud. See you next time.